Chapter 4 divides the child and adolescent years into 5 stages. You don't have to read this whole chapter. Think about the age your child was when she had her brain injury and read just that section. You will find in this chapter a description of the major developmental accomplishments typical of that stage of life. Also, a page or two describing the impact of a brain injury when it's acquired at that stage of development. And then finally, some illustrative case examples, a short story about a child who has had a brain injury at this stage of life, some of the interventions that worked, and an idea about the outcome for the child. How old was your child when he had his injury? Regardless of how old your child is now, read the section in Chapter 4 that pertains to the stage of development that your child was at when he had his brain injury. If he was a newborn up to age 3, read pages 47 to 50. If he was ages 3 to 6, read pages 51 to 55. Ages 6 to 12, when he had his brain injury, read pages 56 to 59. If he was a young adolescent, ages 12 to 16, read pages 60 to 63. And over the age of 16 to early 20s, read pages 64 to 68. Part 1 provided a lot of information about acquired brain injury as it affects the lives of children and adolescents. You now have a good understanding, after reading these chapters, of all the challenges your student faces as he copes with his neurodevelopmental weaknesses on a daily basis at home, at school, and in his community. You understand how his injury may have interfered with normally developing skills and competencies. You probably feel quite ready at this point to move on to a discussion of what you can do to help him get back on track with his development and learning. This is the topic of Part 2 of BrainSTARS, Chapters 5, 6, and 7. In Part 2 of the BrainSTARS manual, we will learn different approaches to problems and strategies for interventions. Again, here is a major difference between children and adults after brain injury. Adults can often tell you very clearly what is different about their thinking, their behavior, and their skills. A child or teenager will not be able to tell you specifically what is wrong or different. Their experience will be that they are just not successful anymore at things that used to be second nature to them, and they are afraid they will never be successful again. You, as their parent or teacher, need to be a detective to understand that their behavior problems are symptoms of an underlying deficit in thinking abilities caused by the brain injury. Look beyond the behavior to discover the root cause of these problems so that you can address them effectively. Chapters 5 and 6 go through this approach in detail and provide you many examples and practice opportunities so that you can become more comfortable and competent at teaching and developing the behaviors you want your child to be exhibiting, rather than focusing your energy on the bad behaviors or the problem behaviors your child is showing. Chapter 5 will describe how to set the stage for successful behavior and learning. And Chapter 6 will show how to teach skills in structured situations and everyday activities. Finally, Chapter 7 provides the interventions that work best for different behavior problems associated with specific cognitive difficulties after brain injury. Chapter 5 begins on page 77. In this chapter, you will first learn how to clearly define a problem, and then how to adjust your home environment or classroom so your child can be more successful. Oftentimes, there is a particular problem. Johnny is storming out of class. Jose is failing science. Mary is having temper tantrums. While this provides us with some information, we need to clearly understand what is underneath the leaving class, failing tests, or tantrums before we are able to put into place an effective plan. In this chapter, we will teach you to focus on behaviors rather than attitudes or assumptions, and then to go about discovering what is underlying these behavior problems so that they continue to be present. Finally, and more importantly, you will learn that discipline strategies and parenting strategies that we all use that are based on applying consequences to misbehavior do not work well for the student with brain injury. If a child has done something wrong or dangerous, typically we might call his name in a sharp tone of voice. We might spank him or give him a timeout period. If we are trying to develop positive behavior, we may make a behavioral contract with him through which he'll earn rewards for good behavior or for avoiding problem behavior. These kinds of approaches do not work well for students who have had traumatic brain injuries. In order to get rid of problem behavior or develop appropriate behavior, it is important to set the stage for the child to be successful by using antecedents. Fortunately, there are tons of antecedents at our disposal. We will teach you in chapters 5 and 6 to use the physical environment most effectively, to use visual cues, schedules, physical prompts, clear instructions and directions, and learning materials that effectively point the child's attention to the skill at hand that you're trying to develop. Sometimes, even when you're addressing a behavior problem carefully, it still persists. In Chapter 6, we teach you how to look for possible reasons for the difficult behavior that just don't seem to respond to your first good efforts. In this regard, some of the worksheets that are provided in the back of the BrainSTARS manual in Chapter 10 can be of great deal of help. Chapter 6 teaches you to identify positive replacement behaviors through functional behavioral analysis. It also teaches you how to develop complex skills in a child by using task analysis and breaking the skill down into component parts. A major value that we discuss in this chapter is maximizing the effectiveness of your teaching by teaching in skills in everyday environments and using the everyday learning opportunities in school and at home to develop skills and competencies for your child. Chapter 7 is the problem-solving index and the neurodevelopmental clusters. This chapter starts on page 111, and it is the longest chapter of the book. This is the chapter that you will be able to use in a quick fashion, cookbook style, if you have a particular area of weakness or developmental deficit that you know you want to go after. If your child is having difficulties with attention, for example, and you want to read up very quickly on some of the things you can do to help her in her everyday life and to solve the problems she's running into frequently because of her attention difficulties, you will go to Blue Tab number 2 in Chapter 7, titled Attention. You'll see a short definition of the problem on the first page and then a listing of behavioral symptoms, difficulties, and concerns that parents and teachers reported of children who have acquired brain injury when attention is the root cause of these behavior problems. Look at the symptoms and behaviors that you see listed around the problem attention. Does this sound like your child? Does she make careless mistakes with her schoolwork, talk excessively, fidget or squirm in her seat? Does she lose things, blurt out questions or answers without waiting to listen, and have difficulty taking turns? If these sound like the concerns and problems that you struggle with your child on a regular basis, then attention probably is the root cause of her behavior and learning difficulties. In this case, the ideas for what to do to help your child listed on the following pages will probably work pretty well to help her do better. In this case, you knew pretty well what the root cause of your child's behavior problem was. Perhaps you had a neuropsychological evaluation or other testing, or your teacher noticed that your child seems to have attention deficit problems. However, you may be very unsure of what is really behind her behavior and learning difficulties. Your BrainSTARS manual provides a thorough index of problems, concerns, and symptoms that have been reported by parents and teachers, and we have broken down these symptoms and organized them into 4 big categories: daily life problems, things like chores and routines; physical concerns; safety, following directions; emotions and social relationships; behaviors and concerns that you may have in your child's expression of emotions, peer relations, and social skills. The third area is language, including conversation, inappropriate language, and speech. And finally, the fourth area is schoolwork, problems that show up at school and problems with behavior at school, including assignments, homework, grades, and tests, for example. Suppose when you went to the section on attention, you read those behaviors associated with that problem and thought, no, that doesn't sound like my child. She does make careless mistakes on her schoolwork, but she doesn't do many of these other things. I'm more concerned about the fact that she doesn't get started on her homework on her own, doesn't seem to listen, and doesn't hand in her homework. Go to the school section of the index. You will find it on page 121. And you will see there your concerns: forgets assignments, as well as makes careless mistakes on schoolwork and not handing in homework. These symptoms or problems all have the number 14 in blue next to them. Blue tab number 14 is the tab for organization. If you now turn to that tab and look at the neurodevelopmental skill of organization, you can read the problems associated with a deficit in this area. If these symptoms and problems sound more like your child, then follow the suggestions for interventions on the following pages. I hope that this helps you understand how to use the BrainSTARS manual as a cookbook using the neurodevelopmental index and those 21 clusters. Basically, you will be using the large center of the book, Chapter 7. You will also find a lengthy written explanation of how to use the problem-solving index and these clusters on pages 111 and 112 of the BrainSTARS manual.